Good evening. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. My name is Stephanie Foggart, and I am the Director of Global Communications at the Soufan Group. Thank you all for joining Day 1 of the Global Security Forum. In today's events and discussions on the changing dynamics of international security, we have heard from governments, international organizations, academics, and policymakers. Now, we will turn our attention to one of the leading voices in documentary film. It is my pleasure to introduce the final session of the evening, a discussion and film screening of the political documentary Totally Under Control. Live from New York City, we welcome world-renowned filmmaker Alex Gibney. For those who have watched his films before, it will come as no surprise that Mr. Gibney has been described as one of the most important documentarians of our time. He has been the recipient of an Academy Award, multiple Emmy Awards, a Grammy Award, and notable other accolades. This evening, we have the pleasure of watching one of his latest films, Totally Under Control, which examines the US response to the coronavirus pandemic. Moderating our discussion this evening, live from Doha, will be Mr. Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. A leading US journalist, Mr. Clemens is a go-to voice for commentary on domestic politics, global economics, and foreign affairs. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Alex Gibney and Mr. Steve Clemens. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to add a little bit to the introduction of our great guest tonight, Alex Gibney. I've had the privilege over many, many years of encounters, dinners, sit-downs with Alex, and each and every time I leave with so much perspiration and sweat after our discussion because of the journey that he has taken me on in whatever passion project, whatever injustice he's trying to put a spotlight on, and he makes those who watch his films and those who talk to him about them work as hard as he does in creating these stories for us. I just want to share a few of the incredible films that he's brought to us because they're very relevant today, and I have to understand these films were done years ago. The film that is in my mind right now is The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley, which exposed so much of the corruption behind the Theranos story. And of course, we see the founder of Theranos on trial right now. Enron, the smartest guy in the room. Taxi to the Dark Side, a tale of an Afghan taxi driver who was murdered in Bagram prison, and so much more about America's engagement in those early days in Afghanistan. Now we've come full circle to withdrawal. 0 Days, a focus on the Stuxnet virus that I think we can say confidently, although they won't, that Israel and the United States concocted together in the cyberspace. And tonight we're going to see and discuss Totally Under Control. I'll let Alex tell where that came from. It's like Relax, Don't Worry sort of title, but it's something, of course, we have so much to worry about. But Alex Gibney is a friend, but he's a kind of uncomfortable friend. It's uncomfortable to talk about these sorts of issues because he's lifting the Band-Aid off of stuff that so many others have tried to cover up. And I want to commend him and thank him for joining us. But Alex, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to open the door on Totally Under Control, the story of the federal government's response to a COVID pandemic. I have seen the film now multiple times, so I'm not going to try to give away all of it, but there will be a few plot spoilers. I'm sorry, folks, it's just impossible for me not to ruin a little bit of it for you because he opens up so many key elements. But first of all, Alex, what drove you at the beginning, not today, because we're in a different place right now, but what drove you at the beginning to say this story of outrageous, there's so many opportunities to show about outrageous incompetence in other areas. Why this one?
Well, I mean, we were all living through it, and I was living in New Jersey, just on the other side of the river from Manhattan. And in April 2020, we were hit by the first wave in the United States, and it was brutal. I mean, the ICU units were at capacity. We didn't have enough. Obviously, then we didn't have vaccines. We didn't have PPE. We didn't have enough tests. It seemed like chaos, and it seemed like everything was breaking down. And I wondered why a country that should have been so well prepared for a pandemic like this was failing so badly. And it seemed to me that it was important to do this film quickly, and we set out to do, I mean, usually a film that I do will take a year or two. This one, I raised the money by the end of April, and by October of that year, we had it out, around the country and around the world.
Tell our
So
audience,
that was that.
tell our audience, Alex, where the title came from.
Well, the title is from Donald Trump. He said over and over again, "We've got this totally under control." I like the word "totally," and obviously that's really what the film is about. Is about the Trump administration's willful denial of the pandemic and the virus, which was really ultimately devastating. I should say I don't think that the Trump administration was alone throughout the world in doing this. I think many governments wanted to believe initially that it would just go away. And certainly, all governments tend to cover up their misdeeds. But the Trump administration really outdid all others, with the possible exception of Bolsonaro and Brazil, in terms of its refusal to reckon with it. And all the more upsetting because, as we learned, and I didn't know this when we started, we really had a rigorous and very detailed playbook for how to operate in a pandemic. And indeed, the Trump administration itself had done had conducted a series of kind of imaginary games for what might happen in a pandemic, and learned a lot from it. And this was just a few months before the pandemic itself. So they were well prepared, and yet they refused to really reckon with the virus when it hit.
Well, I want to come back to that, but I want to also tell our audience that the day after you finished this film, Donald Trump came down and was diagnosed with COVID, and as we know, he came much closer to serious peril than they had. But did you ever have any reaction from those people around President Trump to what he had? Because it was sort of a unique coincidence, and when you finished, and then the person who had been at the top of the decision chain went into the hospital with COVID.
That's right. Well, in a way, it was coincidental, I suppose, in terms of the immediate timing, but one could have predicted it. I mean, it was like the famous line from The Doctor when Edward R. Murrow, the famous broadcast journalist, came into the hospital. And, after many, many years of smoking nonstop on screen, on camera, and the doctor, who was a lung cancer specialist, said, "We've been waiting for you." And I suppose you could have said the same thing about the doctors for Donald Trump. He was flaunting the notion that he didn't need to take any precautions because the disease wasn't going to affect him or anybody else. And obviously, this was, the most insane kind of magical thinking. So, in a way, it was coincidental, but I think it was really inevitable. It's just that it happened the day after we locked picture. That was difficult for us, and we managed to put in a little slug to note that it had happened.
Well, one of the heroes.
I think also, if I can just follow up on one thing,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, Trump survived his bout with COVID due to the intervention of a tremendous number of doctors and treatments that were not available to the average citizen. And I think that's one of the things we weren't really aware of in in April of 2020. But what we became aware is, part of the dilemma of COVID or pandemics like it is not only the disease itself, but when it's spreading so rapaciously, it fills up ICUs and makes medical care very hard, not only for COVID patients, which is what I think ultimately kills a lot of them, is that they don't get proper care because medical staff are overwhelmed, but also many other patients who have need of the ICU or the emergency room. So it was, and we're still seeing a failure to reckon with that in the United States, I think.
I want to share with our audience, both online and in the room, that one of the heroes among many in this film is a man named Rick Bright. Rick was the head of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. For those of you who want to go for a deeper dive, I did a wonderful show with Alex Gibney and Rick Bright for my Al Jazeera English show called The Bottom Line. It's about half an hour like this, but it's really well worth taking a look at because of Rick's particular intriguing insights. But it gets back to what you said a moment ago, Alex, about the playbook that was in place. Rick Bright made that same comment to us when we talked about it before. We had a playbook. We had the institutions. We knew how to deal with a pandemic, right? This was not something that we hadn't conceived or thought of. What was the corruption of the system? What drove such miserable performance? Because I remember, and I will give you one plot, the South Koreans loved America. They loved how we did things. They were looking at how we were going to do things. And the disappointment in their heart to see what was happening was palpable in the film. But I just want to know, I want to make this point because you make it so strongly in the film, we knew how to do this.
We very much knew how to do it. And not only had the Obama administration developed a very comprehensive playbook, but as I say, the Trump administration itself, including Rick Bright and including the ASPR, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, Robert Kadlec, had engaged in a very thoroughgoing exercise just a few months before the pandemic in order to be able to anticipate what the problems might be. And yet they didn't bother to listen to any of the lessons that they had learned. And I think that is I think that's the result of a couple of things. One was that Trump was already running for re-election, and he didn't really want any bad news. And the economy was what was going to take him to the promised land in terms of the election, and anything that would spoil the economy was not news that he wanted to hear. Also, you had an administration that was rigorously anti-government. They believed really in dismantling government. And so when it came time to really put government to work, they weren't that much interested. And even the ultimate task forces that they set up were basically consortia of business people, but business people working on their own with very little help from government. And you see in South Korea, to which we compared the United States response, there was a tremendous amount of interplay between government and industry in ways that were hugely productive. But by and large, there was an enormous distrust for any solution that would in fact come for government. I think ultimately we discovered that Trump literally, purposefully slow-walked testing in the United States because he really didn't want to know how bad it was, even though, as we now know from an interview that was done by Bob Woodward on February 7th, I believe, 2020, he knew very well how deadly the virus was, and yet for political gain, allowed it to spread.
Well, I remember when President Trump said we are testing too much, slow the testing, stop the testing, as it was revealing uncomfortable numbers. There's another part of this, though, and Alex, is one of the reasons why your film is so appropriate for this particular conference, which is dealing with a very broad number of dimensions of security. But part of it is national security in the sense of those citizens, those people, those stakeholders in a society being vulnerable to conspiracy theories, to anti-intellectual arguments, to being swayed by demagogues. And really that can also be read as a function of the decay and collapse of belief in science in some areas. And you and I have talked about this, about the assault on science that was also part of this story. Can you share more?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that throughout the response to the virus was intensely politicized. It was politicized in terms of mask wearing, i.e. if you were on Trump's team, you weren't going to wear a mask. If you were on the other team, you were wearing a mask, and you could see people. We have lots of footage of people in the street screaming at each other. And, you know, people on the Trump team, the so-called Trump team, coughing on people who were wearing masks as if to prove their point. And you can see the damage done when politicians, you know, really speak to that sense of tribalism that I think is hardwired to some extent in all of us, to the exclusion of everything else. And over time, and I think this has been, you see it not just in the United States, but in other countries, you know, authoritarian leaders tend to want to not only divide, but also to refrain from, try to prevent people from accessing expertise that comes from anything but the political system, and that would be scientists. So, you know, you saw that in spades in the Trump administration.
Alice, can you tell us a little bit about the story of Max Kennedy? And yes, he's one of those Kennedys. He's 20 years old, but tell us about Max Kennedy and Jared Kushner.
So that was one of the most staggering stories that I discovered in the film. You know, one of the things that's interesting about this is as we're talking about security, you know, one of the things that turns out was a terrible mistake for the United States is the United States didn't have any ability to manufacture PPE at a moment when it desperately needed it. It's outsourced most of that ability to China, and then the few factories that were there weren't able to get the orders from the government in order to be able to do what they needed to do. Max Kennedy relates to that. He is one of the Kennedys. I believe he's the grandson of Robert Kennedy. And Max was young. He was just, I believe, 24 years old. He had just finished a job. He really wanted to do something to help the pandemic. And so he volunteered, even though this was a Republican administration, to be part of Jared Kushner's new task force. And the task force was to try to marshal and access and obtain PPE, masks and other things in order to, masks and gowns and so forth, in order to be able to fight the pandemic. Well, Max arrives in Washington ready to do whatever is necessary. He goes into a small windowless room at FEMA with 8 other unpaid volunteers, and they wait around for most of the day. They figure they're going to be sent out to get coffee. They're going to, you know, run errands. They're going to do data entry for the august team, which has been assembled by Jared Kushner to be able to access PPE for the American people. Well, by the end of the day, they learned, no, they're not working for the task force. They are the task force. These 8 kids with their own cell phones and their own laptops were supposed to, on their own,
and on
just
Gmail
figure
accounts.
out how to buy PPE.
Yeah, on Gmail accounts.
Just make some calls and see if you can find any PPE and let us know if you do. That was the Jared Kushner. That was the Jared Kushner task force. And so he tells an absolutely gobsmacking story about how these kids did their very best against total government indifference to try to access PPE from around the world. They didn't have any purchasing power. Ultimately, what happened, and one of the things he describes, is that it turns out that this then became a kind of corrupt boondoggle enabled by the Trump administration, where occasionally Max and his team would actually find PPE for sale. They'd negotiate a price, and then 5 firms were chosen. They were chosen out of the blue just because of political favoritism by the Trump administration. And later on, Max was asked to come up with an excuse or a rationale for why they were chosen months afterwards. But they were, these companies would then pay for the PPE. The federal government would then fly the PPE back from whatever country they managed to find them in. And then these companies were permitted, with over 50% of their stockpile, to charge whatever it was they wanted. And as a result, you had these huge price imbalances all over the United States, where states were bidding against each other, and the prices kept going up and up and up and up and up, and there was absolutely no check on that, despite the the aid that to these companies that the federal government had given. So it was utter corruption and chaos.
You know, another story that you tell richly in this, and it actually led to the resignation, or I should say the firing, really, of Rick Bright, whom you're going to see in this film, folks, is the story of hydroxychloroquine, which was a drug that was on the shelf used to treat lupus and others. Can you tell us a little bit about the hydroxychloroquine obsession that evolved around some of those, like Rudy Giuliani and Peter Navarro and other people around President Trump, that really became a national obsession, and we were on the verge of seeing this drug flood, the pathways of America's healthcare system to treat those suffering with COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that hydroxychloroquine, and the advantage of hydroxychloroquine was that it was a drug that had been FDA approved for lupus and other things. And as a result, it could be administered if a doctor decided to use it for another treatment. So there was some hope, and indeed some early studies on hydroxychloroquine, which seemed promising. Those studies were later found to be not particularly good, and ultimately, hydroxychloroquine was found not to be particularly effective. But for whatever reason, Trump got on the hydroxychloroquine chain. And you see two things that are fantastically interesting as a result of this. You see, on the one hand, when Trump wasn't interested in doing anything, as in testing, nothing happened. There was no snapping of the fingers and the bureaucrats, suddenly snapping to attention and saying, yes, sir, we'll do whatever you want. Literally nothing happened. And testing, the lack of testing for weeks and weeks and weeks, crippled the American response. But when it came to hydroxychloroquine, Trump became obsessed with it, and suddenly the whole thrust and power of the American government was thrown behind this drug that had very little use or value that had been proven in any kind of clinical trials for COVID-19. But he insisted that his government, focus all their attention on, and this was language I believe that's in the film, flooding every pharmacy with hydroxychloroquine. So when you have a totally political figure who's not listening to any of the civil servants, everybody falls in line and does what the commander-in-chief wants. And it was a terrifying thing to behold, but both because of what happened with the hydroxychloroquine and what didn't happen with testing.
Hey, listen, Alex, we have an international audience watching this online and in the room. They're from countries all over the world, interested in security, and I want them to be interested in this story, which we're going to see shortly. But I guess the question I have is, what would you, from your lessons of exploring this travesty, would you advise another government or another stakeholder or civil society stakeholders how to avoid this American catastrophe that we saw unfold responding to COVID?
Well, one of the things I was adamant about in doing this film was to make this film a comparison. Most of it has to do with the American federal response.
Right.
But we also spend a good bit of time comparing the US response to South Korea's response to COVID, its initial COVID. And as it turned out, in South Korea and in the United States, January 20th was the day when each country had their first positive test of a COVID patient. So they started on exactly the same starting line. And yet South Korea did a much better job. And why did they do a much better job? Because South Korea had learned. It turns out that learning is tremendously important. Through their MERS outbreak, they made a tremendous number of mistakes, which they then were determined to correct. But instead of being overly politicized, the bureaucracy and indeed business leaders had a wealth of experience, and politicians could see how damaging it would be politically if you failed in the face of a crisis like this. So second time around, they were able to ramp up very effectively a testing program within a couple of weeks of the first test, the first positive test of COVID. So I think in the simplest way, The biggest lesson learned is how to learn, because that's what, over time, governments can get right if they really pay close attention. The problem was, I suppose, the United States had a rigorous playbook, but they just didn't pay any attention to it.
Let me ask you this, the wonderful thing about your film, which I'll tell people, is it takes you back to the timeline. Who knew what when? When did the initial meetings come about? As Alex Gibney just shared, January 20th was a key date. We had a positive test in Seattle in the United States. There were 2 people that arrived in Japan, 2 in Korea on January 20th. And I remember talking to my producers for my show on Al Jazeera English, The Bottom Line. I said, I want to do a show on this. And they said, this virus is going to go away. It's a non-issue. We taped my show on February 10th, which, if you look at that, was very long, because I said to myself, statistically, it was impossible that number of cases came from 1,300 then officially recognized cases in Wuhan. So it was clear to me that there was a deeper story on February 10th of 2020. But now that you have the benefit of hindsight and looking back, Alex, at the Keystone Cops operation on masks, what happened with the failed efforts to set up a testing regime in the United States. And this is a loaded question, but I want to know how criminal you thought the culpability is of many of the players in responding around those early days. Because if we'd gotten this right, I think it would have incredibly impacted the spread that we saw explode, not only in the United States, but around the world.
Well, I'll say 2 things about that. The first thing, in terms of the criminal culpability, we know, as I said before, that on February 7th, Donald Trump told Bob Woodward that he knew how deadly it was and how rapidly it spread. So he had no doubt in his mind about the danger that the United States was facing, and yet he intentionally slow-walked testing. In that way, I think you can safely say that he killed people for political benefit. He literally killed people for political benefit, and you see it happening still in the United States, where the political calculus is that if you have a certain number of people in your base, it doesn't matter if you're killing people, because they're so firmly attached to your base. If you can rile them up in some way, you can overcome it. Now, I do think that Trump lost the election because of COVID. I think that the few swing voters that there were turned against Trump because he had bungled it so badly. But yeah, he intentionally killed people in the United States for political gain. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that. The other thing I would say about this film, which is on a kind of related note, is that there's an enduring value to it, I think. And it was something we thought about a lot when we were making the film. That goes beyond, well, we know so much about COVID now, why do we need to see the film? I think that the film really looks at a moment in time. It's an origin story for COVID, but ultimately it's the origin story for how do you reckon with and learn something about a pandemic whose contours you really can't understand yet. That's really what it's all about, because we're going to see other pandemics and we're not going to know exactly how they're going to spread, whether they're going to spread through droplets or whether they're going to spread through surfaces, and how contagious they are and what their symptoms are. Will they affect older people? Will they affect kids? We're not going to know. And the question is, how do you set up systems that take that into account and be rigorous about how you learn, how you protect people initially, and how you overcompensate for what might happen, which is a terribly hard thing politically, because it's one thing to jump in the middle of a crisis that's already happened. If there's an impending crisis that could get really bad and you snuff it out and you spend a ton of money doing so, people look at you as like, I'm sorry, people look at you like, well, what'd you need to do that for?
Yeah.
Well, you were successful, which is what you want to do.
Alex, let's finish on this this issue, this question. I know your film does not include the Biden administration, but the Biden administration did come in, and around the time it came in, the number of deaths in the United States were about 400,000. And of course, I recognize the deaths are in the millions around the world for our audience watching this. But in the US, it was 400,000. Today, it's slightly above 700,000 during the Biden administration. I guess my question to you is, how, given all you know now, do you see the Biden administration dealing with this? And has the system that you profile righted itself, in your view, well enough to get back to a norm that can handle the next pandemic?
I'm not convinced it has. And in one area I would point to, you would think that by this time and place, you would have easy, cheap, at-home COVID testing for everybody, which would make the diagnosing of the disease so much easier, even at this point, even with an unfortunately large unvaccinated community. I do think that the Biden administration learned a lot of lessons and that they are focusing on this, and they have a lot of very good scientifically experienced people on board. So that's a good thing. But I'm still a bit dismayed at how the Biden administration isn't doing as much as it could in, say, the home testing regime. And part of that problem is honestly goes beyond COVID, because I think one of the things that we're learning about COVID is how much it taught us about so many other underlying problems. And one of those huge underlying problems in the United States is healthcare, the way healthcare is funded, the way it's administered, and the way it's unequally, that access to it is so unequal. Well, one thing you learn during a pandemic is if you have unequal access to healthcare, suddenly you're going to get much more rapid spread, which is really ultimately going to affect everybody. And that's something for a global audience I think we have to think of. Like right now, the other thing I fault the Biden administration for is not being tougher on some of the drug companies, who I think honestly should be willing to give some of their intellectual property to, say, countries in Africa, so that vaccines can be more rapidly manufactured, because so we're getting closer to herd immunity in the United States, but it's not going to help us if COVID mutates and migrates in Africa and then a new variant spreads all over the world. So this is where the local becomes global.
Well, Alex, I'll just say it was such a pleasure to be with you early in your career. I remember the Pacific Century as one of your earliest projects, and since then you've shown yourself to be the vital part of our conscience in looking at things that otherwise wouldn't get the attention, the vital attention they have. So please give a round of applause to Alex Gibney, filmmaker, director and filmmaker of Totally Under Control, which we're going to watch now. Alex, so great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Steve, thanks so much. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
That's it, folks. We're going to watch the film now. Thank you.